Hey, how you doing? This is Adam Post, publisher of more than 1,000 comic books. Today we are talking about how Marvel almost did it. They almost took over publishing all of DC's comics. It was actually very close. It was likely to happen. The deal came to Jim Shooter, and Jim Shooter was very interested in doing it. Only an independent comics publisher, First Comics, stopped it from happening. But let's get into the details. Let's go over the article so we can see what's up with all this. Because I had heard about this, but not in great detail before today, to be honest with you. Before we do, let's go ahead and make sure you're subscribed to the channel. It's a huge help to me. Click the bell for notifications and give me a thumbs up when you like it. All right, this is coming from Newsarama. When Marvel Comics almost bought DC for reals. Once upon a time, DC almost became an imprint of Marvel Comics. Did you know that? I mean, had you heard? Because there's all this talk now about Todd McFarlane's coming in. David Zaslav is going to whack everybody at DC Comics. DC Comics might stop publishing comics altogether. You know what I think about it? Well, I will tell you right now. I think they're going to cut back a lot and switch to graphic novels. That's what I think. And they're going to get somebody very capable of producing stuff that's very excited about their titles. That's what I think is going to happen. We'll see. So imagine a version of reality where Batman was one of the Marvel Universe's secret superhero society, the Illuminati. Interesting. Or where Superman is the leader of the Avengers in Marvel Comics. How could that be? As far-fetched and almost impossible as these ideas feel in today's corporate comic book culture, in some branching timeline of the real-world multiverse, if such a thing even exists, there are almost inconceivable ideas like that have come to fruition. Because in the real world, our world, Marvel Comics almost bought the publishing rights to DC and all its characters way back in the 1980s in a move that would have relaunched the DC Universe as a Marvel imprint. And wouldn't that have been completely nuts? And what would that have done to the movies? This was also like just in the early stages of the direct market, but the direct market wasn't really booming just yet. How amazing would that have been? Like it or not, Marvel Comics has been the leader in mainstream American superhero comics almost without interruption since the Marvel Universe launched in the 1962's Fantastic Four #1. DC, the elder statesman of the superhero comics game, has lingered in second place for essentially 60 years. And in the 1980s, that competition almost caught up with DC. And it's interesting because Shooter's Valiant comics, which were superheroes, but not really traditional superheroes, kind of a different vibe, that was really like the start of a new major back in the day until Shooter left. But, they didn't really have the most exciting looking comics. A lot of them were very straightforwardly drawn. They had Barry Windsor Smith over there doing Exo Man of War and some other things, but they really didn't have like the most exciting looking comics. Image was huge back in the early 1990s in superheroes. There were a lot of Ultraverse was big, and Marvel was receding. They were still very big back then. It kind of just goes to show you it doesn't matter who's first; it matters who's best. And best, that's in the eye of the beholder. But tell me who you think the best comic book publishers have been over the years. I'd be curious to see what you think. And you don't have to say me. You can say other people. DC, hot off an unfortunate run in the 1970s, and Marvel wasn't doing well in the 70s either, in which the publisher massively expanded the number of titles it offered in what it was called the DC Explosion at the time, only to scale back its line to an even smaller number of titles than it had before in a devastating wave of cancellations dubbed the DC Implosion. Not officially, people just called it that, in direct reference to the previous explosion terminology. By the 1980s, and by the way, this is a trend in comic books. Right now, crowdfunding is the absolute hottest thing. Second hottest thing might be comics to film. Back and forth. Brand new trends that never existed in the 1980s, didn't exist in the 1990s. Really, of course, movies started getting involved with comics when Spider-Man was a huge hit in the 1990s. DC's Batman was a huge hit in 1989. But things change in comics. They really do go through cycles. The reason they still exist is because people like you and me are passionate about them, so they kind of always find a way to come back. Had it not been for crowdfunding, they would not be anywhere near the independent publishing that we have now. Crowdfunding, I can't even explain to people who haven't experienced comics prior to crowdfunding, especially independent comics publishing. Completely different world. Much more difficult because there's so many intermediaries like Diamond Comic Distributors, who was always great because they always paid. They always paid on time. Since the 1980s, when Diamond was in business, through up until the pandemic, they'd always paid everyone on time. And to my understanding, they've paid off everyone else since the pandemic. I don't know any other details about that, but what I will say is very, very difficult to publish comic books prior to crowdfunding. These are miracle times. Hopefully they last forever. But as such, in 1984, Bill Sarnoff, the Time Warner executive who had initially purchased DC in the 1970s under the Warner Brothers parent company, reached out to then Marvel Comics editor-in-chief Jim Shooter to inquire, that guy, that's what he looked like in 1982, to inquire if they'd be interested at Marvel in licensing all of DC's characters, titles, and properties for publication, with Warner Brothers retaining the film and TV rights to the characters. Okay, so they would be holding the TV rights. This is kind of similar to what people are talking about Todd McFarlane taking over at DC, or who else could they license the titles and characters out to? That's quite a turnaround from Marvel's early days using DC's parent company, National Distributors, as a distributor for its own superhero comics. Because Marvel needed a distributor for their superhero comics on newsstands. Well, DC owned their own distributor, National Distributors, and they made an agreement, but it limited Marvel's titles to just 6 titles. So Marvel was coming from way behind. It doesn't, and this is a good thing to know about, like in business. It's a good thing to know about in comics and really in everything. You can start way behind. It's not where you start. It's where you end up. And where you end up has a lot to do with how much you care about what you're doing, if you know what you're doing, what the competition's like, and also, are you more passionate than the next guy? And do you listen to what customers tell you? It takes me a while sometimes to listen, but I eventually do. I told him I thought Marvel would be very interesting. And I told him I would discuss it with Marvel's president, Jim Galton. That's my Jim Shooter impression. Not that good. However, according to Shooter, Galton initially balked at the idea, not entirely understanding the value of the characters such as Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and the Justice League. Quote, trying not to sound too crazed, I explained that they were great characters and that the DC editorial people were frankly doing a pretty poor job with them, Shooter's 2011 account states, and that we could do better. Shooter has a website, jimshooter.com. On there, he's got a lot of his Marvel history and his work history, if anybody's interested. With that, talks reopened between Galton and Sarnoff, with the pair actually reaching an agreement to make the deal happen. So the deal was basically an Elon Musk-style done deal. The plan to bring DC's entire publishing wing under Marvel Comics' purview got so far that Shooter even created an editorial plan for which titles would kick off as the DC Marvel era. Quote, I decided that we should launch with 7 titles and build from there, if all went well. The titles were Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Teen Titans, Justice League, and Legion of Superheroes, states Shooter's story of the events. It's worth noting that Shooter himself got his start in the comic industry as the writer and occasional penciler of Legion of Superheroes, yep, he draws, in 1965 at the age of only 13. People would ask Shooter, like, hey, I worked, didn't your father work for DC? Like, no, he's just been doing it for that long. My first published comic was when I was 16 in 1986. But he started younger than me. 13's actually pretty young. I've never heard, I don't know if anyone else worked professionally in comics at 13 years old. Shooter's 2011 blog post states that he estimated he would sell 39 million copies in the first 2 years with an estimated pre-tax profit of roughly $3.5 million. Big money for a comic publisher in 1984. That would have been a lot of money for a comic publisher in 1984. Picture at least 5 times the amount. That's a lot. When news broke of the impending deal, third-party comic publishers already seeing ever-waning profits in the shadow of the looming Big Two of Marvel and DC, protested the deal. One publisher, and this would be Rick Obadiah, an interesting guy, who published First Comics, who also, went so far as to file an antitrust lawsuit against the Marvel-DC deal with the United States federal government, alleging that the merger of the two companies would constitute a monopoly in the comic book publishing industry. Courts eventually agreed, and the deal was quashed. So if it wasn't for independent publisher Rick Obadiah for First Comics, they would have actually done this deal. Shows you independent publishers actually been shaking up the industry for quite a while. And, Rick also, not covered in this article, sued Spartan Printing. And Spartan Printing was this printer in Illinois, off the top of my head. We worked with them for a couple of months. But in any event, he sued the printers because they wouldn't take his comics to print. Rick published Grimjack and a couple other things I don't remember right now, but the ongoing monthly color comics that were actually sold on newsstands and the direct market. And the printer wouldn't even take the business. He had to sue them. They eventually had to take the business. Rick is litigious, so good for him. Amazing that he actually had this effect on the industry, because this would have been a major effect on the industry. Just a year later, in 1985, DC published Crisis on Infinite Earths, reordering and rebooting its entire comic book continuity and reaching a renewed surge of sales. By the end of the 1980s, the publisher was once again receiving critical acclaim and even more increased revenue from titles such as Watchmen, The Dark Knight Returns, and The Sandman. Isn't that wild? Eventually, though, they never merged. Marvel and DC did begin an era of unprecedented crossovers through the 1990s with 3 volumes of Marvel vs. DC and what many fans consider the ultimate DC-Marvel crossover, Kurt Busiek's and George Perez's JLA Avengers. Since the early 2000s, however, there's been a greater distance than ever between the two big publishers, with scant reprintings of any previous crossovers and not even rumors of any new official meetings between the heroes of Marvel and DC. On the other side of the coin, however, Marvel itself was eventually purchased by Disney, as we know. I could never believe that Disney actually got a hold of Marvel for $4 billion when they already had proven their success and proven the success of the Iron Man movie. Why did they sell? The reason they sold actually is because the owners of Marvel wanted to make sure they could cash out and have the money. And you can't fault people. You own a business, you should think about how you're going to sell it, because, that's a big part of somebody's future, like Perlmutter, who turned the comic book publisher into a multimedia giant with its own Marvel Studios films, dominating the box office, with Disney even going on to buy 20th Century Fox. Disney has bought a lot of stuff, and that's how it's kept growing. But as you know, Disney's doing a lot of controversial things right now, and they seem to be wiping out their heroes. Inexplicable that they'd be doing this. But everybody who runs Disney and everybody who runs Marvel at this point, they don't seem to need the money. They just seem to want to do what they want to do, and it doesn't matter what consumers say. It's crazy times, but that's why I'm working on a superhero comic. I'm going to announce more details soon. We're finishing up the promo art so I can do my sign-up list. I need everybody's support on it, or honestly, we have no choice. We really have to go and make the kind of characters, comics, and stories we want to see in the future, especially for future generations. It has to happen now, because craziness has been going on with the big titles for a long time. And while I really do think that there will be an improvement, I do think that DC, under David Zaslav's ownership, at least for right now, is going to correct some of what it's been doing. I don't think Marvel will for a while, at least. They've done too much bad already. Let me know what you think in the comments below about all that. Always like to hear what you have to say. All right, I'll see you again soon with another video, and if I don't see you, I will miss you.